Section 16. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria by William Westgarth. Section 16. Postscript. Melbourne, 1888. Here, 50 winters since, by Yarra's stream, a scattered hamlet found its modest place. What mind would venture then, in wildest dream, its wondrous growth and eminence to trace? What seer predict a stripling in the race would, swift as Atlanta, win the prize of progress 'neath the world's astonished eyes? J. F. Daniel, The Jubilee of Melbourne. And, behold, one half of the greatness was not told me. 2nd Chronicles 9:6. My intended postscript on Melbourne as I found it in 1888 has been delayed until I have seen Sydney also, so that I have a few words of comparison on the two great capitals of the southern section of our empire. Arrival at Hobart. Allow me first to complete the outward passage. I concluded my recollections when still at sea, within about a day of our ship's destination, Hobart. The Tasmanian shores gave us a salutation not usually associated with Australia, that namely of the snow, thickly sprinkled over the southern slopes of the island. I welcomed the scene, both as recalling that of home, and as giving the promise of the highest of civilization, which, as Mr. Froude reminds us, belongs to the countries where the snow remains on the ground. We shortened our course by a few miles in taking the Encontrastes Channel, and were, as I understood, the first of the large vessels from the other hemisphere to do so. We cast anchor off Hobart after nightfall, the many bright lights of the city gladdening our eyes, while the babble of English tongues from the boats around us reminded us once more that, after so many thousands of additional miles since at Cape Town, we were still within the British Empire. Westella Hotel. My first salutation came from an exact namesake of mine, Mr. William Westgarth, whom I had known at Melbourne 35 years ago, and who, after varying fortunes, had for the last dozen years been conducting a superior class of boarding house or family hotel. It was called Westella, and was situated in Elizabeth Street, the chief thoroughfare of Hobart. The house I recollected as that of Mr. Henry Hopkins, a very early merchant of the city, whom I had met more than once between 40 and 50 years ago. It was the undisputed palace of the city of its day, nor was it disposed, even now, to bend its head to any second position. As my friend conducted our party over the pretty scene of garden and cliff behind the house, we found it all wrapped in frost, except where the bright morning sun had struck, and we broke the ice, quite quarter of an inch thick, on a fish pond of the grounds. These Tasmanian ascendancy in the civilized world is secured. Progress of the Antipodes. Already we began in Hobart, and we continued as we went further north, to meet with indications of the progress of the age, quite abreast of, and indeed rather ahead of, all that we have been used to at home. For instance, we were hardly settled comfortably within Westella, when the waiter announced that Mr. Fish the Tasmanian Premier wished to see me. I had met Mr. Fish in London, and I quite expected that he wished to have a talk with me about Tasmanian finance and loans. "Is he waiting?" I asked, jumping up at once to go to him. "No, sir," was the reply, "but he is speaking to you through the telephone." I passed to the telephone room, and the signal being sent that I was in attendance, I was given 2 ear caps and told to listen. A clear, but also a still, small voice came up as from the vasty deep. Whether from the smallness of it, or from my being unaccustomed to that mysterious sort of thing, I did not catch the words, and had to relinquish the business to our hostess, Miss Westgarth, and thus a meeting was conveniently arranged. Australian Features. Fortunately for us, we had arrived in a leisure season in the hotel way, so that our host was free to devote himself to us in sightseeing, and thus, with hardly a day and a half to spare, we got a fair idea of Hobart, including a drive along the hewn road, in whose shaded valleys we found as much snow and ice as though we perambulated the Scotch Highlands in January. This had been, however, an exceptionally severe winter. On the way to Government House my eyes were once more regaled with the gum trees, in the well accustomed form of open forest, the ground being covered with grass, on which sheep were dispasturing. This is the pleasing characteristic of much of Australian scenery. The Tasmanian Main Line. The next day, Sunday, we had to leave for Launceston, by a special train of the Tasmanian Main Line, so as to be in time for the boat to Melbourne, on which we depended for arrival prior to the opening of the great exhibition on 1st August. We formed a large and important party, including the Governor and Lady, the Premier, Treasurer, and Attorney General, while the Auditor General and others were to follow a few days after. We understood there was to be a general concourse from all the surrounding colonies, and so far as regarded the official contribution to the concourse Tasmania had done its duty. While we ran along this, the chief railway of Tasmania, I recalled something of the endless contentions between its proprietors or agents and the Tasmanian Government. The question requires some study, for the literature thereof has already swollen to most inconvenient dimensions. And way of it, the Government would have done best for the colony if they had themselves built the line. As matters now stand, the company cannot be made to maintain the line in due efficiency, because, unfortunately, it has neither capital nor credit to do so. Nor can the amount needed for that purpose be permitted to be taken out of earnings, because that only increases the guaranteed interest properly payable on the bonded debt of the line by the Government. Nor can the Government keep back any of this latter amount, because the innocent and helpless bondholders, or the company as their advocate, are at once down upon them for such atrocity. Nor, lastly, can the colony buy up the line and thus be extricated from the mess, because the company utterly scouts the idea of a sale at mere valuation. The River Tamar. Next day we were steaming down the Tamar, famous for its beauty as a narrow inlet of the sea from Launceston downwards, rather than properly a river. A small boat took us the first 12 miles, and we were then transferred to the larger vessel in which we were to cross the straits. In the former we were rather crowded, for some 25 youths of Geelong were returning from a football contest with some Tasmanian young folks. They kept us lively with songs and recitations, in which the praises of Geelong were dutifully mingled. I was delighted to see the small Geelong of my early memory turning out in such strength, and recalling in a parental way this said small past of the place. I might have maundered in the bless you, my children, sort of vein, had I not been kept in check by the frolicsome humour of the boys. Port Phillip Harbour. Two disappointments awaited me on entering the Heads of Port Phillip. First, it was early morn, just before daybreak, and next, when the day did develop upon us halfway up the bay, it was in such mist and rain as all but deprived us of any view. But the mist and cloud lifted somewhat as we approached Hobson's Bay, and thence I was rushed in to the multitudinous shipping of Williamstown and Port Melbourne, the great harbour works going on all around, the new cut, the crowded wharves, and all the other marvels of modern Melbourne. Melbourne. Here apartments had been provided for us at Scott's Hotel, as Menzies in its near neighbourhood. The more usual place for families was quite full with exhibition visitors. But although our hotel had the noise of ceaseless business below, we on the floor above were so quiet, with the best of attendance and cooking, and with every other comfort, that we are, by choice, to return to it after visiting the other colonies. Here then we opened our campaign amongst old scenes and old friends, separated for more than a generation. I had to ascertain who were dead and who still alive. A glance over the city soon revealed to me that one old friend, the oldest, I might say, upon the ground, had entirely passed away, and that was the old Melbourne itself, which I had left behind me more than 31 years before. But happily the old street names remained, and thus I began to feel again at home. Old colonists' honours. Labours and honours opened at once. The day of my arrival I was to be the guest of the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce, for the honour of a dinner to their first president, my friend Mr. Cowderoy. The secretary had telegraphed me to Hobart, in the hope that I might arrive in time to secure the dinner taking place prior to the exhibition opening, with all its proposed engrossing after festivities. Mr. Robert Reid, whose acquaintance I had made at the Grand Colonial Exhibition 2 years before, was now president of the Chamber, and received me most cordially. For the following day again there was the opening of the exhibition, at which I was to march in the procession through the Avenue of Nations alongside of Mr. Francis Henty, now the sole survivor of the illustrious brotherhood who founded Victoria 54 years before. So far from anticipating such honours, I had been preparing myself to plead, on any public occasion that might offer, the cause of the early pioneers, for although, as I propose to put it, we were but the babes, and have since been succeeded by the men, we were surely to count for something, as without the baby there could never have been the man. But all fears on that head were promptly dispersed, and at every turn honours were poured out upon the old pioneers of the days of small things. I had repeatedly to confess, for myself as one of them, that it was a most pleasant and fortunate accident to have been an early colonist. But one disadvantage of these honours and attentions is, that they are apt to excite the envy of your fellow mortals. Human nature, even the very best, can never be perfect. My old friend James Stewart Johnston challenged my right to appear in the grand procession, where he and a good half dozen other old colonists had equal rights. I replied soothingly, regretting that so glorious a band of early warriors, who had borne nobly all the rough battle of early progress, how eloquent people can be in their own praise, should not have been superadded to honour and adorn the procession. But this not satisfying him, I was driven to bay, and fired my reserved shot, to the effect that I was the only old colonist who had come 12,000 miles on purpose to attend the opening that shut him up. The suburbs. A busy time of public entertainments followed, during the intervals of which I visited energetically persons and places of old association. The Melbourne suburbs were quite as surprising as the city itself. Almost countless miles of streets had taken the place of the country roads or mere bush tracks of my recollection. While I stood wondering at these changes, I had to regret that the old features had so completely disappeared that I was at home nowhere, save that in an otherwise entirely unrecognisable area there would still appear the old name, such as the Sydney, the Richmond, or the Toorak Road. I had to be content with this scant remnant of the past, and to begin acquaintance with an entirely new set of occupant streets and dwellings. Old friends and old times. Then I turned to the old and early friends of the past, some of them kindly called, others less able, I had myself to seek out. Thus I met, besides Mr. J.S. Johnston, already mentioned, Mr. J.A. Marsden, Mr. Alfred Woolley, Mr. E.B. White, Mr. Damon, Mr. Bra, Mr. John Barker, Mr. R.W. Shadforth, the Messrs. Ham and Dr. Black, Mr. Germain Nicholson, another old and worthy friend, was in Sydney, where he called for us, but we have not yet met. I found time to reach Sir William Stawell, at his pleasant suburban residence at Kew, and was most agreeably disappointed to find the veteran head of the law very much more like his former self than report had accredited him. Another old friend, Sir Francis Murphy, I have yet failed to meet, and also Mr. David Moore. Mr. Francis Henty drove us to the St. Kilda Road to pay our respects to Mrs. Edward Henty, who pleasantly surprised us with as yet hardly the marks of age, and as though fully intending to see at least one generation more of the progress of the great colony which her departed husband had founded. Mrs. D.C. MacArthur was still residing at Heidelberg, along with her nieces, Miss Wright and Mrs. Were, the widow of my late old and intimate friend, Mr. J.B. Were. I saluted the former as the venerable mother of Melbourne society, and being thus one of her sons I claimed and exacted the full salutation of sonship. I claimed the same privilege from my other dear old friend, Mrs. A.M. McRae, whom I found hardly changed, in vigour of mind at least, although now 85 years of age. Almost next door was Mrs. Henry Creswick, daughter of my old friend Dr. Thomson of Geelong, of whom, as one of the very earliest and only a few months behind Batman himself, I have already spoken. We enjoyed a chat over the very oldest Victorian times. The Benevolent Asylum. I had one opportunity of taking old friends and fellow colonists in a wholesale fashion. The committee of the benevolent asylum complimented me by so pressing an invitation to visit an institution which I remembered and was interested in from its first commencement, that it was imperative on me to find the time to do so. The spectacle was alike most edifying and most interesting. The institution had enormously extended since my time, both in its accommodation and the number of its inmates. There were nearly 700 men and women, all of them helpless and destitute, and nearly all passed into old age. Some who were paralysed in their lower limbs and unable to move about, were put out in a sheltered place in the sunshine, to busy themselves in various ways of their own choosing, and we particularly noted two rather pretty young women, whose lively expression of face indicated no lack of happiness, and whose neat and nimble fingers turned out quantities of daily work. There was a considerable section of the blind, who were systematically treated, and had a library of their own. In one of the rooms were two dying men, one already past consciousness, the other still observant and even lively, but not expected to survive the night. Amongst so many and such aged people this sight was too familiar to greatly disturb the others. One of these was understood to be related to an English nobleman, and had passed through much adversity of colonial life. His face was still singularly indicative of the gentleman. Such cases are by no means rare in Australian experience. Our inspection was completed by a view of the kitchen and larder, and the interesting spectacle of about 300 of the men engaged together under one roof at dinner, every one whom revelled in solid beef to his heart's content. Included in their number were 12 Chinamen, who seemed as comfortably at home as any of the others, and whose presence, perhaps, helped to impress a Chinese commissioner who had lately visited the asylum, and who had left his record in the visitors' book to the effect that such an institution was an honour to mankind. The old Melbourne Cemetery. The old Flagstaff Hill and the old cemetery were two objects which I sought for on the earliest opportunity, and as the business daytime was so full of work, I took the early morning. The Flagstaff Hill I had soon to give up as quite unrecognisable under new plantations and roadways, but the cemetery in its close vicinity was much as I had left it, and there the old friends, albeit voiceless now, cropped up at every turn. Let me select a few, commenting as I go along, and beginning with the earliest in date. 1841. A series of the well-known early family of the Langhornes, some of whose members I often met. Let me begin with the wife of William Langhorne, who died in this far back year, and end with Alfred, who used to amuse us all with interminable stories, who had a strikingly beautiful wife, and who died in 1874. 1846. The beloved wife of Joseph Rayleigh, aged 32 years, whose funeral I attended, to be witness to the profound grief of the husband thus prematurely bereft of a wife who was, as I recollect, a really fine woman. Even Carlyle's indifference to tombstone literature might tolerate these lines, recorded on her monument, both for their own high quality and as the eloquent expression of the heart of the bereaved husband. Thou art gone to the grave, but we will not deplore thee. For God was thy ransom, thy guardian and guide. He gave thee, he took thee, and he will restore thee. And death hath no sting, for the Saviour hath died. 1846. Alan K. Rennie, of Dundee, Scotland, aged 24, a remarkably fine young man, who died thus early, to the grief of all his friends. He was one of the staff of the Union Bank of Australia. Although the favourite of everyone, he retained his unaffected simplicity of manner and character to the last. He died of consumption in the house of Mr. Castle, who had invited him there when he took ill, in order that he might be better attended to. Castle, James Gill, Alfred Ross, and myself took the last night of the dying lad in relays of 3 or 4 hours each, and when the last breath passed from the fine young face, Mrs. Castle, who stood by with the rest of us, and who had nursed him with the fondest mother's care, broke out into loud sobs of irrepressible grief. We decided upon a broken column as his monument, fit emblem of the life so early broken, and we settled his brief, simple epitaph, which Mr. Castle drew up, erected by his friends in this colony, in testimony of esteem and regard. 1848. Edmund Charles Hobson, M.D., born 1814, died in his 34th year. The monument, erected by public subscription, commemorates also 2 sons and 1 daughter, all the family save one thus early carried off, for, alas, the father, although of large and well-filled mind, was a man of poor health and feeble physique. Mrs. Hobson, our old friend, still survives, but is at present in England. I have already alluded to the doctor and his high qualities. 1850. James Jackson, of Toorak, who died at sea, aged 47. This was Melbourne's greatest merchant of his early time. Although he died at so early an age, his house at Toorak, or rather the second house which he, with his enlarging fortune, built there, but which he did not live to enjoy, was long the finest of the place, and served for some years as the governor's residence. It supplies a striking illustration of the sudden needs of the advancing colony after its golden era. A prominent Melbourne trader had leased it at £300 a year, but in the mid-term of the lease, a demand suddenly arising in 1854 for a government house for Sir Charles Hotham, Toorak was sublet at £10,000 a year. I recall the early, happy Toorak home, where personal beauty in mother and young children lost its edge by being so common. The remaining family are now all in the old country. Mrs. Jackson still lives, the honoured head of a surrounding of descendants, which, to me at least, have been long past counting. 1850. Isabella, widow of James Williamson, solicitor, Edinburgh, aged 70. This is the lady of whom I have already spoken, who gave up 6 fair daughters to the young settlement in its direst need, and who in turn have given to its multiplied sons and daughters. 1850. Edward Kerr, aged 52. In your charity, pray for the soul of Edward Kerr of St Heliers. This is my old friend, the father of separation, from New South Wales, with whom I marched for years towards attaining that object. He was a proud man, who, with his vigour of mind and body, grasped his world with a firm hand, and was not, perhaps, of the humour to ask the help or prayers of anyone. But his church, by enjoining the above formula over its dead, had its own way of humbling even the proudest. Whether the great or the small, the prince or the peasant, I was surprised to find that one who held so commanding a position in our young community should have been, at death, only 52. He took the chief charge of the separation movement, if indeed it did not originate with him, but, sad to say, he died, at this too early age, just the year before the great object of his later life had been attained. In considering this question practically as a merchant, my view of the determining principle as to the mutual boundary line was that the natural tendency of the trading, whether it took the Sydney or the Melbourne direction, should decide. Thus the hoofs of the bullocks, whether they indicated the northerly or the southerly direction, would decide the contentious question. When I mentioned this point to Kerr, who, curiously enough, had wholly omitted it from a very long list of my reasons for separation, he saw at once its importance, and, in incorporating it in his list, remarked that it was worth all the rest put together. Whenever we sat together afterwards at a separation meeting, he would pass me the joke about the hoofs of the bullocks deciding the boundary. Sir Robert Robertson has since told us that Melbourne missed its destiny in this fatal separation movement, for, had she remained within New South Wales, she would have been the capital of Eastern Australia. Well, that slap in the face to us is not altogether uncleverly or unfoundedly directed. The eventuality thus predicted for us might, indeed, have happened, and we too might have hesitated in our divisive course if we could but have foreseen two things. First, that the very next year Victoria should produce as much as 15 millions of gold, and for some 20 years after between 6 and 12 millions yearly. And second, that our mother, Sydney, who had completely the whip hand over us at the time, would have permitted us to use all our great resources in order to place ourselves, at her expense, the first in the race. 1853. The Honourable James Horatio Nelson Castle, H.M. Commissioner of Customs, Member of the Executive Council of Victoria, born 1814, 39 years of age. I have already had to mention repeatedly one of my very best and most intimate friends. He died in November 1853, while I was upon a home visit. He left a message for me that he looked forward to resuming our most pleasant friendship in heaven. What a reality of voice has this hope when it comes thus from the brink of the grave! What a strength of resistance to that tendency of modern science, which, as interpreted by some even of its greatest chiefs, is to abolish the hope of the life beyond the grave, and to class us all with the beasts that perish. The Melbourne Races. Those who delight in contrasts may follow me now to the Melbourne Races. Although not, in any sense or degree, a racing man, I could not forego this spectacle, so illustrative of the socialities of general progress of the colonists. This was a considerable occasion, as there were about 70,000 present, but it was not the Grand Cup Day, an occasion which can muster 150,000. The grand stand here seemed to me, from my recollection, equal to Epsom and Ascot together. The racing was in admirable style, the horses generally taking hurdles and steeples without visible hitch in their pace. I used to have a racing theory which was confirmed here, namely, that the horse should never be allowed ahead, or at least for more than a yard or two, till close on the finish, because he thus loses the highest of the excitement, and is more amenable to fatigue. In one splendid race of a dozen or more, on this occasion, one man who came in far ahead at the first round, I predicted was to lose the race, and so it proved, for at the second and final round he came in only 6th or 7th. The honour of the railway free pass. 16 days of Melbourne life had pleasantly glided away, and we must needs be off, because we had the rest of Australasia to see, and a very brief term for accomplishing so great a business. Honours had been heaped upon us. How we are to take it when we tumble once more to the common level at home, I hardly know, or like to think about. One of the most gratifying of these honours was the railway free pass, which Tasmania first sent us, followed by Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales, and Queensland. Later on I was accorded, through Mr. Labertouche's kind agency, the golden key or pass over the Victorian lines for life, which I was assured was my due as one of the original members of the first Victorian Parliament. From my old friend of nearly 40 years' standing, Sir Henry Parkes, I had a courteous note to the effect that our railway comfort should be looked after so soon as we crossed the frontier. The honour of these things is, by infinity, greater than the mere saving of money. This is to be literally the case, for our daughter is already counting up these savings, with the intention of claiming them for kangaroo and opossum cloaks and rugs. End of section 16.